Welcome to the Oracle's Rest, a place where stories unfold slowly, where time softens, and where the mind is free to wander. Tonight, we travel backward through nearly 3,000 years into the ancient world of Rome, a civilization built upon 7 low hills above a quiet river. A city that began as a small cluster of villages and grew slowly, century by century, into one of the largest empires the world had ever known, stretching from cold northern forests to the warm shores of the Mediterranean, from the deserts of Egypt to the misty hills of Britain, from the banks of the Rhine to the edges of the Sahara, and along the way, shaping languages, laws, roads, architecture, and ways of life that still echo through modern civilization today. The story of Rome begins along a river in central Italy called the Tiber, long before marble temples, before paved roads, before legions marched across distant provinces. The land around the Tiber was quiet. Small villages rested on 7 low hills above the river. Farmers worked nearby fields. Shepherds moved their flocks across the slopes. Smoke rose softly from cooking fires in the early morning. Birds called from the reeds along the riverbanks. And in the evenings, the hills grew silent beneath the stars. According to ancient legend, the city was founded by twin brothers named Romulus and Remus, raised, the story said, by a she-wolf along the riverbanks, set adrift on the Tiber as infants, saved by an animal who carried them to her den. Whether the legend reflects any real history remains uncertain, but the story itself became deeply important to the Roman people, a symbol of their origin, a symbol of strength rising from wilderness, a symbol of a civilization born along the quiet waters of the Tiber. For centuries, Rome remained relatively small, ruled at first by kings according to tradition, then later by elected officials who governed through what became known as the Roman Republic. Power was meant to be shared. Decisions were made through discussion, voting, and law, rather than the will of a single ruler. The Senate gathered. Magistrates were elected each year. Citizens assembled in public places to vote on important matters. Yet, even within the Republic, tensions remained constant between the wealthy and the poor, between landowners and laborers, between old patrician families and newer plebeian arrivals. Still, The Romans were practical people. They built, they organized, they expanded slowly outward from their small city along the Tiber, conquering neighboring tribes, forming alliances, absorbing other cultures and gods, granting partial rights to former enemies, and gradually, over many generations, Rome grew larger than anyone in its early years could have imagined. By the time Rome became an empire ruled by emperors, the city itself had transformed dramatically. What had once been a cluster of villages above a river became one of the largest cities in the ancient world. Some estimates suggest that Rome at its height may have held nearly 1 million inhabitants, a population unmatched in Europe for more than 1,000 years afterward. The streets were crowded with people from every corner of the empire. Marble temples reflected sunlight, forums filled with merchants and orators. Aqueducts carried water from distant hills. Public baths steamed gently in the cool morning air, and rising above it all, palaces, columns, statues, and triumphal arches. For most people who lived in Rome at its height, daily life was filled with noise. The city never quite slept. Carts rattled through stone streets. Vendors called out their goods in markets. Children played in the dust between buildings. Dogs wandered the alleys. Workers carried bricks and tools through narrow lanes. The smell of bread baking, of meat cooking, of olive oil, of incense drifting from temples, of horses, of crowds, all blended together into the constant atmosphere of the city. Most Romans did not live in large, palatial homes. The wealthy enjoyed grand houses called domus, single-family residences built around open courtyards, with painted walls, mosaic floors, gardens, fountains, and dining rooms designed for entertaining guests. The entrance opened into an atrium, where a small pool collected rainwater, falling through an opening in the roof. Beyond the atrium, more private rooms led toward a peristyle garden, ringed by columns. Flowers grew there. Birds sang from cages. Statues stood among the plants. The wealthy Roman house was designed to feel partly enclosed and partly open to the sky. But the majority of ordinary Romans lived in tall apartment buildings called insulae, crowded multi-story structures rising several floors above the streets, sometimes constructed quickly, sometimes poorly, often vulnerable to fire and collapse. The ground floor often contained shops opening onto the street. Above, families lived in small apartments with shuttered windows looking out over the noise of the city. Inside an insula, small apartments housed entire families. Rooms could be cramped, dim, and noisy. Cooking was sometimes done over small braziers because building proper kitchens within these crowded buildings could be difficult and dangerous. Many residents ate out instead, purchasing hot meals from small street-side shops called thermopolia, where soups, breads, sausages, lentils, stews, and warm spiced wine could be bought quickly throughout the day. Long stone counters faced the street, round terracotta jars sunk into them, holding food kept warm by small fires below. Customers stopped, ate standing or sitting, paid a few coins, and moved on. Roman streets themselves were often crowded and uneven, some narrow, some wider, lined with shops, taverns, workshops, and apartment buildings. During the day, the noise was constant. Conversations, footsteps, animals, the wheels of carts, the calls of merchants. Water sometimes ran along channels in the middle of the streets. Public fountains stood at corners. Women filled jugs and carried them home, balanced on hips or shoulders. Slaves moved through the crowd, carrying packages, letters, and goods for their masters. At night, the streets quieted somewhat, but Rome was so densely populated that complete silence was rare. Roman writers sometimes complained about the difficulty of sleeping in the city because of the constant sound of cart wheels, voices, and movement. Wheeled traffic was actually restricted from much of the city during daytime hours, which meant deliveries were made overnight. The rumbling of wagons over stones became one of the familiar nighttime sounds of ancient Rome. For those who could escape the noise, the countryside surrounding Rome offered a different world. Wealthy citizens often owned villas outside the city, estates surrounded by olive groves, vineyards, wheat fields, orchards, and pasture, where slaves and tenant farmers worked the land, and the air felt cleaner. Many Romans dreamed of escaping the city during the hottest summer months, retiring to country villas where they could read, write, hunt, walk through gardens, and rest beneath shaded porticos. Some villas were modest, others stretched across acres, with multiple courtyards, private baths, libraries, and elaborate gardens designed by skilled landscapers. Roman agriculture supported much of the empire. Grain was especially important. Vast quantities flowed into Rome from Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily to feed the enormous urban population. Olive trees produced oil used for cooking, lighting, bathing, and religious ceremonies. Vineyards stretched across hillsides, producing wine that became central to Roman culture. Wheat fields rippled in summer winds. Cattle grazed on distant pastures. Bees produced honey collected by patient beekeepers. Sheep provided wool that was woven into clothing by household slaves or sold in markets. The Roman diet was relatively simple for most people. Bread formed the foundation of nearly every meal. Olives, cheese, vegetables, fish, eggs, and fruit appeared regularly. Lentils, beans, and chickpeas provided protein. Cabbage, leeks, garlic, onions, and carrots were eaten boiled or raw. Meat was less common for ordinary people, often eaten only during festivals or special occasions. Pork was the most popular Roman meat, though chicken, goat, and fish also appeared in markets. Garum, a fermented fish sauce, flavored countless dishes and became one of the most distinctive ingredients in Roman cooking. Wealthy Romans, however, sometimes hosted elaborate banquets with multiple courses, reclining on couches around low tables, eating roasted meats, exotic seafood, sweet pastries, honey cakes, and spiced wines. Slaves moved silently between the diners, offering trays of food and refilling cups. Musicians played softly in the background. Sometimes poets recited verses. Sometimes dancers performed. The contrast between rich and poor in Rome was often dramatic, yet even ordinary Romans participated in moments of public splendor through festivals, games, and shared rituals. Public baths were available across the city, some small, some enormous, capable of holding thousands of bathers at the same time. The largest bath complexes, called thermae, were architectural marvels, with heated floors, vaulted ceilings, marble columns, mosaic floors, libraries, exercise yards, and gardens. Romans of all backgrounds visited the baths regularly. Bathing was not only about cleanliness, it was about socializing, exercising, relaxing, and conducting business. A typical bath visit followed a slow rhythm. A visitor entered, paid a small coin, and undressed in a changing room. Then, perhaps, exercised in an open courtyard, wrestling, lifting weights, throwing balls, walking briskly. Afterward, the visitor moved through warm rooms, hot rooms, and cold pools in sequence. Slaves rubbed oil into the skin and scraped it away with curved metal tools called strigils. Steam rose from the heated floors. Voices echoed off the marble walls. Conversation drifted between bathers. Hours could pass easily within these vast, steam-filled spaces. Outside the baths, the streets often continued moving. Forums filled with people, the Roman Forum at the heart of the city, served as a center for politics, commerce, religion, and daily life. Senators debated, lawyers argued cases, merchants sold goods. Citizens listened to public speakers. Religious processions moved between temples. The architecture itself was deliberately impressive. Columns rose toward the sky. Statues of gods, emperors, and heroes stood among the buildings. Inscriptions covered monuments, commemorating victories and benefactions. Religion in ancient Rome was woven into nearly every aspect of life. The Romans worshipped a wide collection of gods and goddesses. Jupiter, king of the gods, watched over the heavens. Mars governed war and protection. Venus was associated with love and beauty. Minerva represented wisdom and crafts. Vesta presided over the sacred hearth fire, kept burning continuously in the heart of Rome. Neptune ruled the seas. Mercury watched over messengers and merchants. Diana hunted through forests beneath the moon, and countless other deities oversaw specific aspects of daily life: agriculture, household, travel, and weather. Roman religion was practical rather than focused on personal faith in the modern sense. Rituals, ceremonies, sacrifices, and proper observance of tradition mattered greatly. Temples filled the city, each dedicated to a particular god. Priests performed sacred rites. The Vestal Virgins, 6 women selected as young girls, tended the eternal flame at the Temple of Vesta. Their service lasted 30 years. Their role was considered essential to the safety of Rome itself. The flame they tended was believed to protect the city, and allowing it to go out was considered a serious offense against the gods. Families maintained small shrines within their homes, where household gods called the Lares and Penates were honored daily. Offerings of incense, wine, food, or flowers were left at these shrines as part of ordinary household rhythm. The paterfamilias led these household rites, connecting the family to ancestors who had come before and to the gods who watched over the home. And surrounding all of this religious life were countless festivals throughout the year, some honoring specific gods, others marking the agricultural calendar. The Saturnalia in mid-December became one of the most famous, a celebration during which ordinary rules of social order were temporarily relaxed. Gifts were exchanged. Slaves were sometimes served by their masters. As part of the festival's reversal of roles, banquets stretched late into the night. Lamps and candles burned. The streets filled with laughter and the smell of food. Other festivals filled the calendar. The Lupercalia in February, with its ancient rituals connected to fertility and purification. The Floralia in spring, celebrating flowers and the goddess Flora. The Vinalia, honoring the wine harvest. The Compitalia, marking the crossroads, where neighborhoods met. Each region had its own local festivals, often blending Roman traditions with older Italian customs. The Roman calendar itself was filled with sacred days, during which work was restricted and rituals performed. But Rome was not only a city of feasts and temples, it was also a city built on labor. Most of that labor came from enslaved people. Slavery in Rome was widespread and deeply embedded in society. Captives from conquered territories, prisoners of war, individuals born into slavery, debtors, and others all formed the foundation of the Roman economy. Slaves worked in homes as cooks, cleaners, tutors, attendants, and assistants. They labored in fields, mines, workshops, construction sites, and shipyards. Some held positions of relative responsibility, managing estates or businesses. Others endured brutal conditions in mines, galleys, or arenas. The treatment of enslaved people varied widely. Some lived under relatively humane circumstances, trusted by their masters, sometimes, eventually, freed through a process called manumission. Freed slaves became freedmen and freedwomen, often retaining ties to their former masters, but acquiring legal rights and the ability to build new lives. The children of freed slaves were typically born free citizens. This system gave Roman slavery a particular character: bondage that was sometimes lifelong, yet sometimes, for the fortunate, an intermediate stage on the way to citizenship. Others, though, worked in conditions so harsh that survival itself was uncertain. Slaves in silver mines died young from exhaustion, lung disease, and accidents. Slaves rowing galleys suffered through brutal labor under burning sun and cold rain. Slaves working enormous agricultural estates in Sicily and southern Italy revolted multiple times throughout Roman history. The famous slave revolt led by Spartacus shook the Republic in the 1st century before the Common Era. Though it was eventually defeated, its memory lingered as a reminder of how unstable a society built on slavery could become. The reality of slavery shaped nearly every part of Roman daily life. Wealthy households depended on it. So did agriculture, public works, and entertainment. And the contrast between the rights of citizens and the lack of rights for the enslaved became one of the deepest divides within Roman society. Even ordinary citizens of modest means sometimes owned a slave or two who helped with daily tasks. The institution was so common that few Romans questioned it openly, though some philosophers, particularly those influenced by Stoic thought, occasionally argued for treating slaves with more kindness. Citizens themselves enjoyed many privileges. Roman citizenship was highly valued. It granted legal protections, the right to vote, the ability to hold certain offices, and a sense of belonging to a vast civilization. Over time, citizenship gradually expanded outward, eventually being granted to many people across the empire. The Emperor Caracalla, in the early 3rd century, extended citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire. The Romans understood that integrating conquered populations through citizenship and law often proved more lasting than ruling them solely through military force. Roman law became one of the most enduring legacies of the civilization. Codified rules governing property, contracts, family, crime, inheritance, and many other aspects of life were developed and refined across centuries. Legal scholars studied carefully. Courts handled cases according to elaborate procedures. The principles developed within Roman law later influenced legal systems across Europe and beyond. Even today, many modern legal terms and concepts trace their roots back to Latin and Roman jurisprudence. The 12 Tables, an early codification of Roman law, were displayed publicly so that ordinary citizens could read them. The idea that laws should be written down, public, and applied consistently became one of Rome's lasting contributions. The Roman army, meanwhile, became one of the most disciplined fighting forces in the ancient world. Legions were organized into precise units. Soldiers trained extensively. Roads, forts, and supply systems were built to support military operations across vast distances. Legionnaires marched enormous distances, carrying their own equipment, building fortified camps each evening before resting. The reach of the Roman army extended from Britain to the Middle East, from the Atlantic coast to the Black Sea, from the cold Rhine frontier to the warm sands of North Africa. A legionnaire's life was demanding. Soldiers served for many years, often 20 or 25. They were paid in coin, provided with food, and trained in weapons, marching, engineering, and discipline. Upon retirement, they received a grant of land or money. Many veterans settled in colonies, established near the frontiers. Their farms and families gradually transformed the surrounding regions, bringing Roman customs and language to lands far from Italy. Yet the army was not only an instrument of conquest, it was also a major builder. Roman soldiers constructed roads, bridges, aqueducts, walls, and fortresses across the empire. Many of these structures remain visible today, their stones still resting along ancient routes that once carried legions, merchants, messengers, and travelers across the Roman world. Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain still snakes across the green hills, marking the once frontier between Rome and Britain. and the territories beyond. Sections of Roman roads still rest beneath modern European highways. The traces of ancient frontier forts can be seen in fields across Germany, France, Spain, and the Balkans. The road system itself became one of the most impressive infrastructure achievements of the ancient world, stretching for tens of thousands of miles, connecting distant regions through engineered routes designed to last for centuries. Roman roads were built in layers, a foundation of large stones, then smaller stones bound with mortar, then a paved surface of fitted slabs. Drainage ditches lined the edges. Milestones mark the distances. The famous Via Appia, the Appian Way, stretched south from Rome through the countryside, lined in places by ancient tombs and family monuments. The Romans believed deeply in the practical value of engineering. Aqueducts brought fresh water from distant mountains and rivers into cities and towns. Long arched structures, sometimes stretching for miles across the countryside. Water flowed gently downward through carefully calculated gradients, powering public fountains, baths, and homes. Roman engineers studied gravity, materials, geometry, and hydraulics carefully. Their methods became foundational to later European engineering traditions. The Pont du Gard in southern France, the aqueduct of Segovia in Spain, the remains of the Aqua Claudia near Rome, all stand as reminders of how seriously the Romans took the movement of water. The arch itself became one of the defining shapes of Roman architecture. Earlier civilizations had used arches, but the Romans developed and refined them extensively. Arches allowed weight to be distributed efficiently, making possible the vast vaulted ceilings of public buildings and the long arcades of aqueducts and bridges. The development of Roman concrete, a mixture using volcanic ash, lime, and other materials, allowed the Romans to build structures of remarkable durability. Some Roman concrete has lasted longer than modern concrete, in part because chemical reactions within it have continued strengthening the material across centuries. Public works projects shaped life across the empire. Bridges crossed rivers. Harbors welcomed trade ships. Markets filled with goods from distant lands. Spices from India. Silk from China. Amber from Northern Europe. Olive oil from Spain. Glass from the Eastern Mediterranean. Wine from Gaul. marble from Greece and Asia Minor, slaves, grain, wool, dyes, and countless other commodities flowed continuously across Roman trade routes. The Mediterranean Sea itself became something the Romans called Mare Nostrum, meaning our sea, a vast body of water, surrounded almost entirely by Roman-controlled territory. Shipping routes carried grain ships from Egypt to Rome. Smaller vessels moved goods along coastlines. Merchant fleets traveled between major ports. Storms could be dangerous, however. Ancient ships could be lost beneath the waves during violent weather. Yet, despite these dangers, maritime trade became essential to feeding and supplying Rome. Without grain ships arriving regularly from across the Mediterranean, the enormous population of the capital city could not have survived. The port of Ostia, at the mouth of the Tiber, became one of the busiest harbours of the ancient world. Warehouses lined the docks. Cranes lifted cargo. Slaves and labourers worked from dawn until dusk, unloading ships. And while Rome itself often shines in modern imagination, the empire stretched across an extraordinary variety of landscapes. From the forests of Gaul, where Roman roads cut through ancient woodlands, to the dry plains of Spain, where olive groves stretched across rolling hills, to the deserts of North Africa, where caravans crossed beneath the burning sun, to the cold frontiers of Britain, where soldiers stood watch along stone walls, beneath grey northern skies, to the warm coasts of Asia Minor, where Greek-speaking cities had existed for centuries before the Romans arrived. Within each province, daily life differed depending on geography, climate, and culture. Yet certain Roman features appeared everywhere. Towns laid out according to a grid plan, forums at their centre, public baths and amphitheatres, Roman-style temples, inscriptions in Latin carved into stone, roads paved with carefully fitted stones. Even today, the remains of these provincial towns can be visited across modern Europe and parts of Africa and the Middle East. The Roman ruins of Volubilis in Morocco, the aqueducts of Caesarea in Israel, the amphitheatres of Tunisia, the walls of Trier in Germany. Education in the Roman world varied significantly. Depending on wealth, wealthy boys, and sometimes girls, learned to read, write, and study literature, rhetoric, history, and philosophy, tutors, often Greek slaves or freedmen, taught them within wealthy households. Some students later traveled to cities like Athens or Alexandria to study further. Rhetoric was especially prized. The ability to speak persuasively in public was considered essential for political and legal careers. Boys practiced delivering speeches, memorizing classical texts, composing arguments in Latin and Greek. Ordinary Romans often received less formal education. Many could read and write at least basic Latin. Public inscriptions, graffiti, signs above shops, and election notices painted on walls suggest that literacy reached more deeply into Roman society than is sometimes assumed. The walls of Pompeii, preserved beneath volcanic ash, still contain countless examples of casual Roman writing. Notes from one neighbor to another, complaints about a bad lover, jokes, love letters, political slogans, praise for favorite gladiators, small fragments of daily life frozen in time. Pompeii itself offers one of the clearest windows into ancient Roman life. The city was buried by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in the year 79, beneath layers of ash and pumice. Homes, shops, streets, gardens, and even small everyday objects were preserved. Loaves of bread sat in ovens for centuries. Painted walls retained their colors. Fountains stood still beside shaded gardens. Walking through Pompeii today can feel almost like walking into the ancient world itself. A city paused mid-breath, nearly 2,000 years ago. The eruption of Vesuvius reminds us how dramatic ancient life could be. Earthquakes, fires, plagues, and natural disasters affected Roman cities, just as they affect modern ones. Pompeii had already suffered earthquake damage years before the eruption. Some structures were still being rebuilt when the volcano erupted. The people who lived there could not have imagined what was coming. Their final hours were captured in plaster casts, in carbonized bread, in scattered objects. Their lives suddenly stopped, became permanently preserved within the layers of ash. Nearby Herculaneum, a smaller and wealthier town, was buried beneath a different kind of volcanic flow. Its wooden beams, furniture, and even ancient documents were carbonized rather than burned. Charred scrolls discovered in a library there are still being unrolled by modern scholars using advanced imaging techniques. Texts unread for nearly 2,000 years are gradually being recovered. Words written by ancient philosophers whose voices had been silent since before the time of the empire, are slowly returning to readability. And yet, much of ancient Roman life was not dramatic at all. Most days passed quietly. Children learned to walk in courtyards. Mothers prepared simple meals. Workshops opened at sunrise. Farmers tended crops. Soldiers stood watch along distant frontiers. Old men sat beneath shaded porticos discussing politics. Old women told stories to grandchildren beside small fires. The ordinary rhythm of human life moved continuously beneath the larger events recorded by historians. Roman families themselves operated according to specific traditions. The household was led by the paterfamilias, the male head of the family, whose authority over wife, children, and slaves was significant. In legal theory, this authority was extensive. In practice, daily family life often involved cooperation, affection, and shared responsibility, much like in other times and places. Marriages were often arranged for economic and social reasons, yet many marriages also became loving partnerships. Funerary inscriptions sometimes contain moving expressions of grief from spouses, parents, and children. Children were raised within extended family networks. Funerals, weddings, and birthdays were observed with rituals, connecting families to their ancestors and to the gods. Many homes contained small busts or portraits of deceased relatives, whose memory was preserved as a sacred part of the household. The Romans took ancestor veneration seriously. Wax masks of distinguished ancestors were sometimes worn in family funerary processions, connecting the present generation visually to those who had come before. Roman women, while limited by law in many ways, often exercised significant influence within their families. Some managed estates, some operated businesses, some became patrons of artists, writers, and religious institutions. Within wealthy families, women could be remarkably educated and politically connected. The wives, mothers, and daughters of emperors sometimes wielded enormous influence behind the scenes. Although ancient writers, mostly men, rarely recorded their lives in detail, Livia, the wife of Augustus, became one of the most influential women in early imperial Rome. Plotina, the wife of Trajan, was known for her wisdom and political instincts. Many lesser-known Roman women managed family fortunes, raised children, and contributed to the daily life of the empire in countless ways, now mostly invisible to history. Roman entertainment, when it occurred, could be spectacular. The Colosseum in Rome became one of the most famous structures in the ancient world, a massive amphitheatre capable of holding tens of thousands of spectators, where gladiatorial games, animal hunts, public executions, and dramatic performances took place. Gladiators became famous figures within Roman society. Some lived under brutal conditions. Others gained celebrity status, their faces appearing on graffiti, lamps, and merchandise. Some won their freedom through repeated victories. Others died young in the arena. The games themselves reflected the contradictions of Roman society. Brutal violence took place beside elegant architecture. Skilled engineering supported entertainment that often involved suffering. Roman writers debated the morality of the games. Some criticized them. Others justified them as preparation for hardship or expressions of imperial power. Either way, the spectacles became central to public life, drawing crowds from across the city and the provinces. Emperors used the games to demonstrate generosity and to win popular favor. Free or subsidized grain and games together became known as bread and circuses, a phrase used by Roman writers to describe how rulers kept the urban masses content. Beyond the Colosseum, other entertainments filled Roman life. Chariot races at the Circus Maximus drew enormous crowds. Some estimates suggest the Circus Maximus could hold more than 150,000 spectators. The races were intense. Charioteers raced around tight curves at dangerous speeds. Crashes were common. Famous charioteers became celebrities. Fans formed loyalties to different racing teams. The greens, the blues, the reds, and the whites. Sometimes these loyalties spilled into the streets as rivalries between fans erupted into arguments and brawls. The poet Juvenal complained that Romans seemed to care more about the races than about politics or virtue. Theatre also remained popular throughout Roman history. Comedies and tragedies were performed in stone amphitheatres across the empire. Some Roman comedies, written by playwrights such as Plautus and Terence, are still studied today. Mime, dance, and music accompanied many public performances. Festivals brought traveling entertainers to towns and cities throughout the year. Acrobats, jugglers, musicians, singers, actors performing short comic routines in marketplaces. Music itself appeared in nearly every aspect of Roman life. At banquets, religious ceremonies, funerals, weddings, theatres, and military parades, Romans played a variety of instruments: flutes, lyres, harps, drums, horns, and water organs. Songs were sung at private gatherings. Soldiers marched to the sound of trumpets and drums. Religious processions moved through cities, accompanied by music drifting through the streets. Even in the home, music sometimes accompanied dinner. Hired musicians playing softly while families dined. The rhythm of Roman daily life shifted across the seasons. In summer, the city could become unbearably hot. Many wealthy Romans escaped to country villas. Slaves continued the harder labor under the burning sun. In winter, cold winds blew through the streets. Snow occasionally fell on the 7 hills. Fires burned in braziers and small hearths within homes. The smell of wood smoke drifted across rooftops. Heavy woolen cloaks were drawn closer against the chill. Soup steamed in clay bowls. The Roman year itself was divided into months that survive in modified form to this day. January, named after Janus, the two-faced god of beginnings. March, after Mars, the god of war. June, possibly after Juno, the queen of the gods. July and August, renamed in honor of Julius Caesar and Augustus. The Roman calendar had been reformed by Julius Caesar himself, who introduced what became known as the Julian calendar, a system of 365 days, with a leap year every 4 years. This calendar remained in use for more than 1,000 years afterward. Time within each day was measured differently from modern hours. The Romans divided daylight into 12 hours, regardless of season. This meant that hours in summer were longer than hours in winter. Public sundials and water clocks helped citizens estimate the time. Markets opened at certain hours. Court cases began at others. Bathhouses typically opened in the afternoon. The day was structured around the slow movement of sunlight across the sky, and night in Rome held a particular character of its own. Without modern lighting, darkness arrived more completely. Wealthier households burned oil lamps and beeswax candles within their interiors. But many parts of the city became dim once the sun set. The streets, though, were not always silent. Carts often delivered goods at night, since wheeled traffic was restricted during the daytime. In many parts of the city, the rumbling of cart wheels over stones became a familiar nighttime sound. Roman writers occasionally complained about the difficulty of sleeping because of this constant night traffic within homes. Evenings often passed quietly. Families gathered for meals. Lamps flickered against painted walls. Children listened to stories from grandparents. Wine was poured. Slaves served. The day's events were discussed. And eventually, the household settled into sleep. Beds were sometimes simple. A mattress on a wooden frame, coverings of wool or linen, pillows stuffed with straw or feathers. Within wealthy households, more elaborate beds existed, carved frames, finer fabrics, soft mattresses, but the basic act of sleeping remained essentially familiar across the centuries. And while the city slept, sentries continued walking through the streets, watching for fires. Fire was one of Rome's greatest dangers, with so many people living in tall wooden buildings, using open flames for light and cooking. Blazes could erupt suddenly. The famous Great Fire of Rome in the year 64 destroyed much of the city. Emperor Nero's response to the fire, his role in the disaster, and the rebuilding that followed became matters of long historical debate. Rumors that Nero had played his lyre while the city burned were spread by his enemies, though the historical reality remains uncertain. After the fire, parts of Rome were rebuilt with wider streets, more fire-resistant materials, and improved layouts. The emperor also organized professional firefighters, known as vigiles, men who patrolled the streets at night, carrying buckets, axes, and ropes, watching for the first signs of smoke. Their barracks were stationed throughout the city. Their work, though dangerous, helped prevent many smaller fires from spreading. The city continued to grow and change. throughout the imperial period. New emperors added new monuments. Old buildings were repaired or replaced. The forum was expanded. New temples and basilicas appeared. The Roman skyline shifted gradually across the centuries. Trajan added a magnificent forum with a tall column carved with reliefs, depicting his military campaigns. Hadrian commissioned a sweeping rebuilding of the Pantheon, with its enormous concrete dome that still stands today. Aurelian later surrounded the city with massive walls that protected Rome through later centuries of instability. The Pantheon, in particular, remains one of the most extraordinary surviving monuments of ancient Rome. Its enormous dome, made of concrete with an oculus open to the sky, was for many centuries the largest dome in the world. Sunlight streams through the central opening, moving slowly across the interior throughout the day. Rain falls through it and drains through small openings in the floor. The mathematics of its construction continue to inspire architects 2,000 years later. Standing inside the Pantheon, even modern visitors sometimes describe a feeling of awe, difficult to put into words. The space itself feels timeless. Yet beneath all of these monuments, ordinary Roman lives continued in patterns that any modern reader might recognize. People worked. People worried. People loved. People laughed. People mourned. People hoped. They sat down to meals together. They watched the sunset over the rooftops. They listened to rain falling on tiled roofs during winter storms. They greeted neighbors at morning markets. They argued politics in taverns. They wrote letters to distant family members. They lit lamps as evening approached. They wondered, as humans have always wondered, about what tomorrow might bring. Letters themselves became an important part of Roman life. Wealthy Romans wrote frequently to friends, family, and political contacts. Cicero, one of the most famous Roman orators and statesmen, left behind hundreds of letters that survive today. Through them, modern readers can glimpse the texture of his daily concerns, his worries about politics, his affection for his daughter Tullia, his grief at her death, his complicated friendships, his irritation with various people, his love of philosophy, his attempts to balance public duty with private peace. The letters of Cicero remain among the most personal documents to survive from the ancient world. Other Roman writers shaped the literary heritage of the civilization. in different ways. Virgil composed the Aeneid, an epic poem connecting the founding of Rome to the legendary hero Aeneas. The poem became a national treasure, taught in schools for centuries, and admired far beyond the borders of the empire. Ovid wrote playful and beautiful poetry about love, mythology, and transformation. His Metamorphoses became one of the most influential collections of mythological stories ever written. Horace composed elegant odes and satires, reflecting on friendship, wine, and the brevity of life. Catullus wrote tender, passionate, and sometimes biting poetry about his loves and rivalries. Philosophical writers also flourished. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher and tutor to a young Nero, wrote essays and letters reflecting on virtue, time, and the nature of the good life. Marcus Aurelius, an emperor who lived nearly a century after Seneca, kept a private journal of philosophical reflections that survived to become the famous Meditations. His writing, never intended for publication, contains some of the most thoughtful reflections on duty, mortality, and inner peace ever produced in the ancient world. Even today, readers find in his words a calm and quiet voice across the centuries and outside the city. The vast machinery of empire continued operating. Provincial governors administered distant territories. Tax collectors gathered revenues. Soldiers patrolled frontiers. Engineers maintained roads. Merchants moved goods across seas. Slaves labored in mines and fields. Diplomats negotiated with distant kingdoms. Messengers carried letters across the empire. On official imperial post routes, the reach of Rome extended further than most ordinary citizens would ever travel during their lifetimes. For those who did travel, the experience was often slow, but increasingly possible. Roman roads made overland travel more reliable than in earlier ages. Inns and resting places were built along major routes. Travelers could rent horses, carriages, or simply walk. Pilgrims visited sacred sites. Students journeyed to centers of learning. Soldiers were stationed across the empire. Merchants moved between markets. Officials traveled on government business. Even tourism existed in a recognizable form. Wealthy Romans visited Egypt to see the pyramids, Greece to admire ancient temples, and Asia Minor to view famous ruins. Some travelers left graffiti on ancient monuments, Greek inscriptions carved into the legs of the colossal statues at Thebes by Roman tourists more than 2,000 years ago can still be read today. The act of visiting a famous site and leaving behind a mark of one's presence is, it turns out, very old indeed. Roman tourists climbed the pyramids. They visited the supposed tomb of Alexander the Great in Alexandria. They sailed up the Nile to see ancient temples. They walked through the ruins of Troy, already ancient even in Roman times. For those who remained in their towns and villages, the empire arrived in subtler ways. Roman coins passed through their hands. Roman law shaped their legal disputes. Roman gods sometimes joined their local pantheons. Roman architecture influenced new buildings. Roman language, Latin, gradually spread through the western half of the empire, while Greek remained more common in the east. The cultural reach of Rome extended far beyond direct political control. Coinage itself became one of the everyday symbols of Roman authority. Coins minted in Rome and provincial capitals circulated across the empire. They bore the portraits of emperors. They carried inscriptions in Latin and sometimes Greek. They depicted gods, military victories, and architectural monuments. Even people who had never seen the city of Rome could hold its image in their hands. A small bronze coin carrying the face of Trajan or Hadrian or Antoninus Pius, a daily reminder of the distant power that ruled their world. Religion itself continued evolving across the centuries. Traditional Roman gods remained important, but new religious movements also spread across the empire. Mystery cults from Egypt, Persia, and the Eastern Mediterranean attracted followers. The cult of Isis, originally Egyptian, found devotees across Rome. The cult of Mithras, with roots in Persia, became especially popular among soldiers. Mithraic temples, called Mithraea, can still be found beneath modern European cities. Underground chambers where soldiers and citizens once gathered for secret rituals involving the bull-slaying god Mithras, and eventually a new religion that began in Judea spread across the empire. Christianity gradually grew from a small, persecuted movement into one of the most influential forces in Roman history. For much of its early existence, Christianity was viewed with suspicion or hostility by Roman authorities. Christians refused to participate in traditional Roman religious ceremonies. This refusal was interpreted as disloyalty. Periodic persecutions occurred. Christians were sometimes executed, exiled, or imprisoned. Yet, despite the dangers, the religion continued spreading. Quietly meeting in private homes, spreading through letters, missionaries, and personal connections. Eventually, in the 4th century, Christianity was legalized by the Emperor Constantine, and later became the official religion of the Roman state under Theodosius. This transformation reshaped Roman culture profoundly. Churches replaced temples in many cities. Christian holidays joined or replaced traditional festivals. Bishops gained political and social influence. The old Roman religion did not disappear immediately, but its central role gradually faded. The cultural landscape of late Rome blended old and new traditions in complex ways, and while religion shifted, politics did as well. The Roman Empire, vast as it was, faced ongoing challenges. Border defense required enormous resources. Internal conflicts erupted between rival generals and emperors. Economic strains affected the empire's stability. Plagues sometimes devastated populations. The Antonine Plague in the 2nd century and the Plague of Cyprian in the 3rd century may have killed millions and weakened the empire significantly. Along the empire's edges, new groups of people pressed inward. The empire's response to these pressures shifted across centuries. Eventually, the empire was divided into 2 halves for administrative purposes. A western half centered on Rome and Italy, an eastern half centered on a new capital called Constantinople, established by Emperor Constantine. The eastern half, sometimes later called the Byzantine Empire, would continue for another 1,000 years. After the western half declined, the West experienced increasing instability. Across the 5th century, Rome itself was sacked by foreign armies multiple times. The political power of Rome weakened. Local kingdoms emerged from former Roman provinces, and the Western Empire eventually transformed into the early medieval world. Yet calling this transformation a single sudden fall would be misleading. Roman culture did not disappear. Roads continued to be used. Latin continued to be spoken, gradually evolving into the Romance languages of Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian. Roman law influenced new legal systems. Christianity preserved Roman administrative structures within church organizations. Many ordinary people continued living lives that resembled their grandparents more than they differed. The transition from late Roman to early medieval Europe took place gradually across many generations. And throughout this long history, the memory of Rome itself never quite faded. Later, emperors, kings, and rulers continued claiming Roman legacies. The Holy Roman Empire, established centuries later, took its name partly as a reference to Roman imperial tradition. Renaissance scholars rediscovered ancient Roman texts. Painters, architects, and political thinkers drew inspiration from Roman models. The influence of ancient Rome continued shaping later civilizations. Long after the Western Empire ended, American government, with its Senate and Republican forms, drew partly on Roman models. Words like republic, senate, and capital still carry their Roman origins. And tonight, as we drift slowly across the centuries, perhaps it becomes possible to imagine ordinary moments within that ancient world. A baker rising before dawn in Pompeii, lighting the oven, kneading dough by lamplight, the first loaves rising in the warmth, a senator in Rome walking toward the Forum at sunrise, wrapped in a wool toga against the morning cool, his slave following with documents and writing tablets, a soldier standing watch along the wall in northern Britain, looking out across misty hills toward unfamiliar landscapes, breath fogging in the cold air, a merchant on a ship in the Mediterranean, watching the sails fill with wind beneath a clear blue sky, hoping the weather will hold until port. A mother in a small Roman town, carrying bread home from the market, a child playing with a wooden toy beneath a fig tree, a scribe copying a manuscript by candlelight inside a quiet library, a fisherman casting nets from a small boat along the Tiber, an old man feeding pigeons in a sunlit courtyard, a farmer pressing olives in a stone press. As autumn winds move across the hillsides, a potter shaping clay on a slow turning wheel. In a workshop opening onto a quiet alley, a weaver moving the shuttle back and forth across a loom, in the corner of a sun-warmed room. These quiet moments were the substance of ancient life, not only emperors and battles, not only marble monuments and grand spectacles, but ordinary people moving through their days, drinking wine, watching stars, listening to rain, telling stories, holding their children, saying farewell to friends, watching the sun set over hills they had known since childhood. The Roman world was filled with the same kinds of human experiences that fill any world: joy, sorrow, ambition, love, fear, hope, and those experiences left traces in written letters that survived through the centuries, in broken pottery and worn coins found in the soil, in inscriptions on ancient stones, in mosaic floors discovered beneath modern fields, in the curved foundations of Roman walls, still visible across the European countryside, in wax tablets recovered from ancient wells, in carbonized scrolls beneath the ash of Vesuvius. If you walk through Rome today, you can still see echoes of the ancient city, the remains of the Forum, the Colosseum, the Pantheon, pieces of aqueducts still standing along the outskirts, roads with traces of ancient paving stones, the Tiber still flowing through the city, the same 7 hills rising above the river, the light still falling across the same horizons that ancient Romans once watched at dawn and dusk. The same evening, shadows stretching across the same stones. And beyond Rome itself, ancient remains stretch across many countries. The Roman walls of York in England, the aqueducts of Segovia in Spain, the ancient theatres of southern France, the Roman ruins of Tunisia and Libya, the columns of Palmyra in Syria, the fortresses scattered along the Rhine and the Danube, the mosaic floors uncovered in country villas across Britain and Gaul, the ruins of Roman bathhouses in places now far from any modern city. Across these many places, fragments of the ancient world still rest beneath later civilizations. For more than 2,000 years, people have looked at these remains and wondered about the lives behind them. Who walked these streets? Who carried water through these aqueducts? Who carved these stones? Who wrote these inscriptions? Who lived in these houses? The names of most of them are gone. The voices of most of them are silent, yet their footprints remain across the soil of the ancient world. Perhaps that is part of what makes ancient Rome so fascinating. Across the centuries, the combination of vastness and intimacy. The empire stretched across continents, yet within it, ordinary human lives unfolded in ways much like our own. A father teaching his son to read, a grandmother telling stories about the old days, a young man writing letters to a girl he hoped to marry, a widow lighting incense at a household shrine, a traveller unpacking belongings in a small inn beside a Roman road, a child watching swallows wheel above the rooftops in the evening light. History is often told through emperors and battles, through marble columns and famous monuments. But beneath those grand stories, countless smaller stories unfolded. Lives that lasted 70 or 80 years, or 20, or 2. People who never appeared in any chronicle, whose names appear nowhere, whose faces are unknown, yet whose existence shaped the ancient world, just as much as anyone whose name became famous. In country villages across the empire, life moved according to the slow rhythms of the seasons, ploughing in early spring, planting as the days lengthened, tending crops through the long summer, harvesting under the bright autumn sun, storing grain and pressing olives as the air grew cooler, repairing tools and weaving cloth through the long winter evenings. Generations followed each other through the same seasons. Children grew up in the same villages where their grandparents had grown up. Doors opened to the same hills. Fountains splashed into the same stone basins, worn smooth by centuries of use. Even in the cities, families often stayed in the same neighborhoods for generations. The same baker's shop opened each morning. The same shoemaker worked at the same bench. The same widow lit the same household shrine. The same young men gathered at the same tavern in the evenings. The same children chased the same dogs through the same alleys. Daily life was, in many ways, deeply rooted, familiar, local. Even as the empire stretched across continents, most Roman lives were lived within the radius of a few streets or a few fields. Roman gardens, when families could afford them, became important spaces of rest. Even small homes sometimes contained tiny garden plots. Larger homes featured peristyle gardens, ringed by columns, lavender, roses, violets, ivy, and laurel grew within them. Small fountains splashed gently. Songbirds called from cages. Marble statues stood among the plants. In the heat of summer, the garden offered cool shade. In the cool of evening, it offered a place to walk and talk. Even modest gardens contained a few pots of herbs, mint and parsley and thyme, growing on small balconies above the streets. Roman cuisine made constant use of herbs, garlic, vinegar, honey, and olive oil. The famous cookbook attributed to Apicius preserves recipes from the imperial period, sources of fermented fish and spices, stews of pork with apples and honey, custards thickened with eggs, sweet cakes made with honey and pine nuts, cheese eaten with bread and grapes. The Romans loved strong flavors, sweet, salty, sour, and savory combined freely. Wine flavored with honey, herbs, or rose petals appeared at banquets. Water was sometimes mixed with vinegar and herbs to make a refreshing drink for soldiers and workers, called posca. Roman markets, called macella, sold fresh food from across the empire. Fishmongers laid out fresh catches from the sea. Bakers stacked loaves of dark and pale bread. Vegetable sellers arranged greens and roots in baskets. Butchers hung cuts of pork and lamb. Fruit sellers offered figs, apples, pears, grapes, and pomegranates. Depending on the season, the market filled with the smells of cooking food, fresh produce, and the river of conversation among shoppers and vendors. Coins changed hands. Slaves carried purchases home in cloth bags. The morning hours were the busiest. By the heat of midday, the markets quieted. Medicine in ancient Rome combined practical observation with religious belief. Roman doctors treated wounds, set bones, performed surgeries, and prescribed herbal remedies. The famous physician Galen, whose writings survived to influence medieval and Renaissance medicine for more than 1,000 years, lived and worked in the imperial period. Surgical instruments recovered from Pompeii reveal a level of medical sophistication often surprising to modern viewers. Forceps, probes, scalpels, and bone saws all existed in forms recognizable today. Yet Roman medicine also relied on prayers, charms, and offerings to healing gods. The god Asclepius was associated with healing, and his temples served as centers for those seeking cures. The sick sometimes slept overnight in the temple, hoping to receive a healing dream. Inscriptions left by grateful patients describe cures attributed to the god: eye troubles, persistent fevers, wounds that would not heal. The line between medicine, prayer, and folk remedy was often thin. Childbirth remained dangerous in the ancient world. Many women died young due to complications. Many children died in infancy or early childhood. Family inscriptions sometimes mourn children who lived only weeks or months or a few brief years. The Romans were not strangers to grief, yet they were also accustomed to celebrating births with rituals, gifts, and prayers to the goddesses who watched over mothers and infants. A newborn was placed on the ground and lifted into the father's arms in a ritual of recognition. A few days later, the child was given a name in a small family ceremony. Roman clothing, though varied, followed certain familiar patterns. The toga, that famous draped garment, was actually a formal piece of clothing, worn mainly by male citizens on important occasions. Daily clothing for most Romans consisted of simpler tunics of wool or linen. Women wore long tunics called stolae, often draped with shawls called pallas. Sandals were the most common footwear, though soldiers and travelers wore more substantial leather boots. Children wore simple tunics until reaching adulthood. Slaves wore practical clothing suited to their work. Colors were brighter than the white marble ruins of today might suggest: red, yellow, blue, green, and purple dyes colored Roman fabrics. Wealthy Romans wore garments dyed with expensive Tyrian purple, made from the secretions of murex sea snails. The dye process was difficult, and the color was deeply prized. Roman emperors eventually claimed Tyrian purple as a near-exclusive symbol of imperial authority. Even now, the word purple carries echoes of that ancient royal association. Hairstyles varied with fashion and era. Wealthy Roman women sometimes wore elaborate hairstyles, built up with curls, braids, and ornaments. Mirrors of polished bronze allowed them to inspect their appearance. Cosmetics included powders, perfumes, and oils. Some included lead-based ingredients that, in retrospect, were probably harmful. Roman men generally wore their hair short, though styles varied across centuries. Beards were sometimes fashionable, sometimes out of favor, depending on the era and the example set by emperors. Daily routines often began before dawn for working people. Bakers rose first to start the ovens. Farmers walked to their fields at first light. Slaves prepared the household for the day. The wealthy might rise more slowly. A morning ritual called the salutatio brought clients, friends, and dependents to a patron's house to pay respects and request favors. The patron received them in the atrium, listened to their concerns, offered advice or small gifts of money. These relationships of patronage were central to Roman society. They bound powerful families to networks of supporters across generations. After the morning salutatio, the day moved on through its various activities. Business in the forum, visits to the baths in the afternoon, the main meal taken later in the day, the evening spent at home, at a banquet, or in conversation with friends. Romans valued conversation. Roman writers describe the pleasures of talking through philosophical questions with friends over wine, of reading poetry aloud beside a lamp, of telling stories beneath a peristyle garden as the sun set behind the columns. Astronomy and the night sky also held a particular place in Roman thought. Roman astrologers studied the movements of the planets and stars. Many Romans, including emperors, consulted astrologers about important decisions. The connection between celestial movements and human affairs was widely accepted. Stargazing was also a common pleasure. Roman writers described looking up at the Milky Way, stretching across summer skies, the same stars that humans had looked up at for countless generations, the same constellations now familiar through modern names, but already named in ancient times. The constellations of the zodiac came to Rome from Greek and earlier Mesopotamian traditions. Aries, Taurus, Gemini, and the others moved across the Roman sky, just as they move across modern skies. Roman names for the planets gave us our own: Mars, Venus, Mercury, Jupiter, Saturn. The very language of astronomy still carries Roman traces, each planet associated with a god whose nature reflected the planet's appearance and movement. Mars, the red planet of war. Venus, the bright planet of beauty. Mercury, the swift messenger, and throughout all of these many threads of Roman life, the city itself continued to grow, change, suffer, and recover. Emperors came and went. Some ruled briefly, dying by assassination or revolt. Others reigned for decades, presiding over periods of relative prosperity. Trajan led Rome to its greatest territorial extent in the early 2nd century. Hadrian consolidated the empire and travelled extensively across its provinces. Marcus Aurelius defended the northern frontier while writing his quiet philosophical meditations between military campaigns. The lives of emperors were observed closely, recorded by historians, debated by later generations. Yet the lives of ordinary Romans continued regardless. A man named Lucius might spend his entire life in a small town in Gaul, never seeing the city of Rome. A woman named Tertia might raise her children in a fishing village along the Adriatic coast. A boy named Marcus might grow up in a winemaking region of Spain. A girl named Julia might learn to weave in a small village in Britain. Their names, lives, joys, and griefs are mostly lost to us, yet they once existed. They once breathed. They once laughed and cried beneath the same skies that we still see above us. And as the night deepens across the empire, perhaps it is possible to imagine those many lives at rest, lamps being extinguished in countless homes across the Roman world, the shutters being closed against the cool evening air, the day's last conversations fading into murmurs and then into silence, the sounds of cities and villages and farms, quieting beneath the slow turning of the stars. In the heart of Rome, the great public spaces become quieter, the forums empty, the temples close their doors, the shops shutter for the night, the taverns dim their lamps, and the last customers wander home. The narrow streets between the insulae fill with darkness, broken only by the small lights of patrolling vigiles, or the occasional lantern carried by a slave on some late errand. In the country villas outside the city, the lamps in the libraries burn lower. The poet finishes his last verse and sets down his pen. The owner walks once more through the garden to listen to the fountain before retiring. The doors close. The household quiets. The slaves retreat to their own quarters. The night settles over the olive groves and the vineyards beyond. Along the frontiers, soldiers stand watch on the walls. Stars appear above the cold hills of Britain. The fires in the forts burn low. Sentries pace slowly along their assigned routes, watching for any movement in the darkness beyond. The breath of horses rises in the cold air. The watchword is exchanged quietly. Somewhere a distant owl calls. Somewhere a distant fox crosses a moonlit field. The world along the edge of empire grows hushed. On the seas, ships rock gently at anchor in distant ports. Sailors sleep in narrow bunks beneath wooden decks. The water laps softly against painted hulls. Stars wheel above masts that creak softly in the breeze. The horizon stretches outward, dark and vast. In the morning, the sails will be raised again, and the voyage will continue toward distant ports. But for now, the ships rest, and in countless small homes across the empire, families sleep beneath their roofs. The father, the mother, the children, the grandparents, slaves in their separate quarters. A small lamp may still burn in a corner. A late voice may still murmur through a window. But mostly, the world has grown quiet. Mostly, the streets have emptied. Mostly, the great machine of empire has slowed for a few hours into the natural rhythm of rest. The Tiber continues flowing slowly past the silent quays. The stars wheel slowly overhead. The wind moves gently through the cypress trees on the hillsides. Owls call softly from ancient towers. Foxes move through old olive groves. A faint mist gathers in the low places near the river. And gradually, even the imagined city itself begins fading into darkness. Lantern light dimming. Sounds softening. Distances stretching. The marble columns growing pale beneath the stars. The Forum becoming a quiet field of shadows, the Colosseum standing silent against the night sky. The aqueducts arching gently into darkness. The roads stretching outward toward sleeping provinces. The sea moving softly along distant shores. Above the Pantheon, the stars shine through the oculus, their light falling in a slow column across the interior. The marble floor cool beneath the silver glow. No footsteps, no voices, only stillness within the great dome. The dome itself almost dissolving into the night sky above it. In the gardens of the Palatine Hill, fountains continue their soft murmuring. Lamps glow faintly in the windows of imperial palaces. The Emperor, whoever he is in this moment of imagination, eventually surrenders to sleep, his worries set aside for a few hours, his advisors gone to their own beds, the corridors of power quiet, the dogs in the kennels resting on warm straw, the horses in their stalls quietly breathing. Along the Appian Way, the long line of ancient tombs grows silent, the names carved into stone become harder to read in the moonlight. The pines along the road sway slowly in the night wind. Crickets sing softly from the grass. Stars shine above the road that stretches outward toward Capua and beyond, and throughout the countryside. Fields rest beneath the night, wheat ripening slowly through the dark hours. Olives swelling on their branches, grapevines twisting along their trellises, sheep gathered beneath ancient oaks, cattle dozing in their pastures, a lone shepherd checking his flock by lantern light before returning to his small hut, a farmer dreaming of the harvest to come in the towns of the provinces. Similar quiet settles in Pompeii, in Ostia, in Lugdunum, in Aquileia, in Carthage, in Antioch, in Alexandria. Different climates, different languages, different local customs, yet the same slow turning of the night above, the same lamps being extinguished, the same families settling into rest. A merchant in Antioch finishes counting his coins by lamplight and locks the strong box away. A scribe in Alexandria sets down her stylus beside an unfinished scroll. A boy in Carthage falls asleep, listening to his grandmother's stories. A soldier in Lugdunum drifts off in the warmth of the barracks, while comrades snore around him. A widow in Aquileia closes her shutters against the night. A child in Ostia sleeps with one hand curled around a small wooden toy. And tonight, 2,000 years later, the night air still moves across the same hills. The same Tiber still flows toward the sea. The same Mediterranean still rolls toward the same coasts. The same stars still rise above the same horizons. The empire is long gone. The emperors are dust. The legions are silent. The marble has weathered. The mosaics have cracked and faded. Yet something of that ancient world still lingers in the imagination. Something of those countless ordinary lives still seems near somehow in the quiet of the night. Perhaps when we walk through the ruins of a Roman forum at twilight, we sense it, the echo of footsteps that walked these stones 2,000 years ago. the echo of voices that once filled these now silent spaces, the echo of lives lived in the warmth of the sun and the cool of the evening, lives that lasted, like ours, only a brief while, then ended, then passed into the long stream of memory and forgetting. Yet some traces remain. A small lamp recovered from the ruins of a kitchen. A child's bracelet found beside a body in Pompeii. A letter written in ink that has not entirely faded. After 20 centuries, a name carved into a stone above a tomb, a line of poetry that has survived from one generation to the next, a wall that has refused to fall, a road that has refused to be entirely lost beneath the soil. These small things still speak quietly of a world that once existed, of people who once lived, of moments that once mattered, of joys and sorrows and small kindnesses that no historian recorded, but that filled the texture of ancient days, just as much as the deeds of emperors. And tonight, as the imagined city of Rome lies far away across the centuries, perhaps it can still feel close. Lantern light flickering against painted walls, a small fountain murmuring beside a marble courtyard, a vine climbing a stone wall in the moonlight, the smell of bread baking in a nearby oven, the distant sound of footsteps on a quiet street, the soft barking of a dog somewhere in the dark, the slow turning of the stars above the rooftops, a soldier resting near a flickering fire, along a frontier post, wrapped in a wool cloak, watching shadows move across the wall, a scribe in Alexandria copying a Greek manuscript by oil lamp, the sea breeze drifting in through an open window, a farmer in southern Italy walking home through olive groves as the sky turns red above the hills, a child in a small village curling beneath a thin blanket while parents speak quietly in the next room. The Roman world contained millions of such moments, each one small, each one ordinary, each one quietly real, together forming the texture of an entire civilization, a world that no one alive today has ever seen, yet a world we can still imagine through the fragments it left behind. And as the night deepens further, perhaps the streets of ancient Rome grow quieter still. The forums fall silent. The temples close their doors. The lamps in the insulae are extinguished one by one. The taverns shut their shutters. The carts cease their rumbling. The slaves rest at last. The citizens close their eyes. even the emperors, in their grand palaces on the Palatine Hill, eventually surrender to sleep, and above all of it, the moon rises over the 7 hills. Silver light resting on the Tiber, reflecting softly along the marble columns of distant temples, falling gently across the rooftops of 10,000 homes, across the slumbering city, across the sleeping empire, across the silent countryside, beyond the walls of the city. The roads stretch outward through moonlit fields, the Via Appia south toward Capua, the Via Flaminia north toward the Adriatic, the Via Aurelia along the western coast, long pale ribbons of stone winding through the dark landscape, empty now in the deep hours of night, silent now beneath the stars, yet still leading outward toward distant provinces, still connecting the heart of empire to its farthest edges. Travelers who once moved along these roads now sleep in roadside inns. Their horses rest in stables. Their carts wait in courtyards. In the morning, the journeys will resume. The wheels will turn again. The dust will rise again. But for now, the roads themselves seem to rest, empty stones under the moon, patient as they have always been, patient as they will always be, until only the slow rhythm of the ancient world remains. Stars above the Tiber, rain across olive groves, wind through cypress branches, the patient breathing of a sleeping city, soft, distant, quiet, and ancient. The night moves on. The hours pass. The stars wheel toward morning. But morning is still far away. For now, the ancient world rests beneath its long, quiet sky. Lamps dim, voices fade, doors close. Sleep gathers, a river flowing, a wind moving, a star turning, a breath, another breath, stillness, distance, silence. Rome, sleeping.